Hey class, this is your first lecture. It's about climate change. It's a global issue, and the reason why we talk about it as our first lecture is because it contains a ton of other issues in it. It contains your understanding of how to be a citizen, what the origins of history are, and the ideas of migration and your livelihood and the future, all in one thing. But most importantly, it contains how you can start becoming a thought-minded activist for issues that are really important to you and the future. So to begin, climate change, in our terms, is something that's a fact. It is something that happens regardless of humans or not. Climate is always shifting. And I'm not talking about weather. Weather is something that you go outside and you see all the time. That's the way that it's a sunny day some days and it's raining on others. That is not climate change. Climate change is the bigger issue that actually took the place of the term global warming back in the day. Because global warming really is what's going on, but climate change is the result. So it's hard to call it global warming because we won't actually feel it sometimes getting warm. We might actually feel it getting colder. But the idea that it's shifting more rapidly is climate change itself. And in terms of why we refer to it as a factor in knowledge base is because it is backed up by science. And so today we're going to talk about how science got there and why we see this as an issue, why this becomes politicized or anything, and what this means to us and our future. I think it's really important for you to start considering it, especially if you live on Long Island, because it is a region that is affected by climate change. So to start, we're going to talk about how we got to now. By understanding how we got to now, we're going to get a better view of how we'll get to the future and what we could do about it and where do these rights come from. So climate change is human accelerated shifts in the weather, and that is something that's happened within the last 100 or so years. Our discussion after this is going to be, why do you think journalists themselves play a role in which they believe that they have to report on other sides and why they aren't doing things that we feel? So really, when we talk about climate change, we're talking about our amendment rights and our ability to understand information. So let's start at the beginning. And I mean literally the beginning. So let's start with people before we get to the other parts of history. About 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age started receding. Technically, we're still in an Ice Age, but we're in a receded Ice Age, which means the glaciers have actually pulled back away from the southern parts of the world and have moved further north, allowing humans, us, to create civilizations and society. So when you start thinking about how soon ago that was, it's important because let's put it this way. About 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 BC, people started recognizing that seasons no longer covered the ground in Arctic ice, and they were able to say, oh, you know what, we could stick around this year. And in sticking around, they learned how to domesticate a few things. They learned how to domesticate wheat and animals. By domesticating animals over several generations, and I mean lots of generations, they were able to stay in one spot for a while. In staying in that one spot, they were able to forge foundations and make buildings and create civilization and societies around it that created culture. Now remember, that's pretty interesting because it was 5,000 more years of living like that before history was created. Now you probably think, well, history, when did that even start? Well, history starts about 6,000, 7,000 years ago at the latest. History is when we take media, content that's created by humankind, and attach it to context, how we understand that in terms of their people. Now, media's been around for a while. If you've taken a history of media class, you know it goes all the way back about 35,000 years to France. The cave paintings. That's media, sure, but it really doesn't have any context. We're not sure what that media meant. We're not sure how that meant something to the people, but we know it existed. About 5,000 years ago, not only did we create media that had context, but we created written language. And that written language allowed people to keep information for another generation. We were able to contextualize people, but also have an understanding of what could come next. And that's a huge leap forward for humankind. That allowed us to create empires and civilizations that created societies, and then culture itself comes from that. What's interesting about that is the empires, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman, all created something that affects us today, citizenry. And so to be a citizen was part of how to be an empire. Remember, let's go back to ancient Greece. And the ancient Greeks created democracy, which is the demos, the people, the ability to participate in your government, the ability to have a say in how decisions were made. So that ancient Greek civilization not only had an ability to create foundations and land and spaces for life, but also the ability to participate in civic life. So that goes all the way back 3,000 years, the idea of civic life. But we could jump even more forward as what it means to be a citizen. So let's take the Romans, for example. Rome was an empire, but to be a Roman wasn't just to be in Rome, Italy, or thereabouts. It meant to be called a Roman, to be understood as a citizen. So for example, if you were in southern France and a Roman ship appeared on your shore around, let's say, 150 AD and destroyed your town. It was probably pretty brutal. If you were to be taken over, you would have been left over with the idea that, well, now who's in charge? But it wasn't just who's in charge, but who was in charge gave you the right to be called a Roman. And by doing that, they created citizenry, the sense of belonging. And in the sense of belonging, you became part of their people. Now, another 500 years forward, and that civilization collapsed. Religions appeared, and monotheism dominated, and Christianity became one of the dominant cultures. That was coherent through its language and its ability to have a singular story that was able to be shared. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, many more empires appeared, and then it goes into something that we call, well, though inappropriately, the Dark Ages. And that's because oftentimes history is written by the winner, and we often get Christian texts as the winning text. And what we don't realize is that Islam and other religions had become dominant. Math became important. Algebra was invented. And some of the biggest technological innovations of our world are created between 800 and 1200. But really, the biggest innovation that happens, and the big shift that brings us to now, and eventually leads us to the why climate change is part of who we are, is the Gutenberg Press. Now, I know you might think, oh, that's the printing press. I've taken history media. But the printing press was invented about, well, 1400 years earlier in China. The printing press was first invented to print money. And of course, it was printed too much of the money, and China went bankrupt in the 1st century AD. You can't print too much because it devalues your money. The Gutenberg press, on the other hand, is actually called the movable type machine. And the movable type machine allows one press to slide keys in, and you could use the same press over and over to create new things, rather than meticulously cutting out every single letter and printing it each and every time like a woodcut. This allowed mass media to be created. It's our first mass media. So we were able to spread information rapidly. In that spread, we first printed the Bible, but later we printed many other texts. It allowed information to reach the people, and literacy boomed. Literacy created many offshoots, and you could find these offshoots everywhere, from people needing glasses. The idea of glass itself being clear coming from Venice created a demand for people to actually read, and their eyes were never necessary for reading, and now all of a sudden you would like to be literate and read it. So a lot of these things are all connected. In that connection, it births the Renaissance, the idea that we have age of beauty and rebirth that could come back from the time in which we cared so much about all of this that was to be brought back. Of that, we created the minds, the collective minds and sharing of information that births the Enlightenment about 300 years ago. Now, you see how recent that is? The Roman Empire lasted almost 1,000 years, and just 300 years ago, we entered the Enlightenment. Later, future historians will refer to this era as the early information age. And I know you think, early? Man, I've been on the internet my whole life. I've seen every meme possible. Yeah, I mean early. Think about this in 200 years. Imagine what we'll be seeing on the internet then. Maybe we'll be connected via neural link through our brains. I have no idea. But what I know is that we are in the earliest stages of the Enlightenment, even though it's over 300 years old at this point. And so it's important to understand that in this contextual way, because the biggest shifts that occur happen during the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, when we move toward the revolution and age that we are in now, which is the Industrial Revolution or the Great Acceleration. And that is the time in which technology and industry have combined. And the Industrial Revolution brings us to climate change. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring in the idea of new and amazing equipment, but it brought in the idea that we can mass produce. And in that mass production, it moved labor to the front line of consuming and product, these two halves. Somebody had to consume what was being made, but it had to be made. To power the Industrial Revolution was the concept of steam power. How do you turn these turbines? How do you make it work? Well, they found coal. Now remember, coal is a fossil fuel. It's called a fossil fuel because it literally comes from the fossils of dead trees. Millions of years old, a seam of the geological history of the thousands of forests that have been crushed and removed of all their oxygen to create coal seams. These coal seams are dug out, they're burned, it boils water, it turns a turbine. Now here's where things get interesting. The turbine, the same one that turns the engine on the train, it's the same one that creates our new printing press, the turbine press. It allows us to have a circular press where we can print thousands of newspapers simultaneously. And that simultaneity is really incredible because now information is spread even more rapidly. We can now get information to everyone. But this also creates a new type of ideology, and that ideology is called nationalism. It's the birth of exclusion. That if you had industry in your area, you may have had access to newspaper printing. In that access, you can create a newspaper in your language. But it also eliminates languages that don't have in the printing press. And now your borders, sovereign nations, appear because of this. So if you're French and you print a newspaper in France that is written in French, it reaches as far as the border would go. And after that border, it would be in Spanish or German, based on whichever direction you were going. But this way, people were really had pride in their language because it was printed. And that print, if you read Benedict Anderson's Imagining Communities, becomes an imagination of people that we had had always through civilization. But now we have that in the sense of belonging. Nationalism is the willingness to die for that country or that pride. And that's important because it's arbitrary. There aren't really borders. You can't touch them. And in the next lecture, when we talk about migration, you're going to understand that that's something we're going to have to think about is how do people move around this planet? You can't turn off globalization, though you can protect it as best as possible, which is what people try to do. So where does climate change come from this? Well, when you burn coal, it outputs carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide becomes part of the greenhouse gases. Now, in the invention of the car and mass production, including eating meat, remember mass production of cows and being able to consume that, creates an outlet of methane that goes into the atmosphere as well. Now, here's how greenhouse gases work. We hear that term, but we may not be sure of it. Our Earth has an atmosphere. That's what makes it able for us to live and breathe here. Now we're going to go further back, before humans. Let's say about 3 billion years back. When you go about 3 billion years back, you find plant life basically there. And plants make a byproduct, oxygen. And because we have an atmosphere, the oxygen filled the atmosphere and was able to keep breathing there. It encouraged new life over the course of billions of years. But oxygen also does another cool property that staves off radioactivity from outer space. If you were in outer space without a suit, well, with a suit, even with a suit, and a sun radiation or radiation were to hit you, like a blast from the sun, you'd pretty much have full body cancer within hours. It's almost like getting hit with the atomic explosion. There's so much radiation in space that's trying to get to us. Now, our atmosphere does two things. We have the poles that deflect the radiation away from us, but also allows for radiation particles to bounce off of our atmosphere. Now, in the thinning of our atmosphere because of CO2, parts per million in the atmosphere, which we're now at 410, particles from the sun will actually go through the atmosphere, bounce, but now because there's not enough, it will start bouncing back off onto the Earth over and over again. So we actually get the sense of a greenhouse, where it actually stays warm around us. Now that seems like, all right, that's not big of a deal, because when we look at the science around this, we're looking at maybe a 3-degree shift upward in the next 200 years. You're like 3 degrees. That doesn't seem like that much of a change. But think about it this way. Keep an ice cube out at 31 degrees. What happens to the ice cube? Nothing. Barely anything. It'll just sit there. But at 34 degrees, it starts melting. Very slowly, but it melts. And that's where the big shift occurs. 3 degrees might not seem like a lot, but it is a lot of temperature shift. Now what happens is we start seeing that the ice shelves start breaking apart, filling up the ocean. Now, what you're going to see in the discussion board is the rising seas studies. Not that the seas will rise, because they will, but how much so. And you'll be asked to be a prompt on that as well. So there's 2 prompts in here about journalism and about rising seas and effect on people. And so in that, we also know that there's something about the ice that could be problematic. The ice is a time capsule. It's been saving all of history, just like a geology. Just like dirt keeps dinosaurs, ice keeps gas. It keeps the atmosphere. So when you put ice in the freezer, it's keeping some of the air that was around your room at the same time too. Make that on the macro scale, and you have these seams of ice that give us all of history, thousands of years. In a tough freezing zone, we get a whole seam that's just a seam of methane. And when you melt down to that level, all that methane gets released all at once. There's an actual term for this. It's called the belch, actually. It's when the Earth belches and puts all of its gases back into the environment and creates a rapid acceleration of climate change. Why aren't we paying attention to this? Why aren't we concerned? Well, you're going to watch 2 films for your assignment, Chasing Ice and Before the Flood, both of which describe climate change in their macro scales. And you're going to see what it means to visualize what that looks like, to see the reduction of the ice sheets and what that will mean to us in our future. But what happens when we integrate the misconceptions and all these ideas of news and information to it? What is the role of the journalist inside of this? What is the role of migration? Where's the press? Now, let's start with migration. Let's think about this. If you live on Long Island and you live south of Sunrise, you're likely going to be affected by climate change in the next 100 years. I know it doesn't seem like much right now, but it's pretty close. I mean, it's going to happen. Hurricane Sandy is supposed to be a once every 500-year storm. But in the future, it's going to be once every 50 years or once every 10 years. And remember, a 3-inch water rise or even a foot water rise doesn't really look like much. But when you have a storm surge, which is a hurricane on the shore and it pushes the water, it is a lot of water coming at once. Because maybe a foot of water, 1 square foot of water isn't a lot. But imagine that an ocean full coming at you. Those types of waves are what you saw with Sandy. Now, if you're consistently hit by Hurricane Sandy's over and over, you're going to have to move. Now you become a refugee. Now, that refugee means that you're going to have to go find a place to live. Where are you going to go? Are you going to go to the Poconos? The Catskills? Now, the better question is, do they want you? Do they want Long Islanders to be migrating across the United States to find places of dryness away from their land? That migratory status isn't something we think about as something that happens to people in the United States. It's something we think of as somewhere else. That refugee status means your country has pushed you out. But this could happen based on weather as well. There's a lot of claim, although maybe unsubstantiated, that ISIS may have been created because of climate change. That because of massive droughts, these droughts have caused people to look and seek for new sources of power and structures. Let me give you an example of power and structure. Your local supermarket contains about 4 days of food. 4. You probably don't think about that often, but you have to understand that the amount of supermarkets you have in your town or where you can have access to them is because they've calculated how much it would take an entire town to consume all that food, and it's about 4 days per. So one part of that food chain would collapse the entire thing. I mean, just for example, look at what happens during a snowstorm or a hurricane and you've got to go get your milk and bread. You have to go get it. So you know the chaos that can occur from that. And if you understand that chaos can occur just from one storm, imagine it on the macro scale and how big that could be when we have to have food supply lines that are broken. These are all part of climate change that we're not really ever thinking of. And that brings us to why aren't we thinking of it? Well, what is the role of journalists? The freedom of the press is protected by the First Amendment, but we don't often understand why the journalists aren't talking about this all the time. There's decries of fake news and falsities and misbeliefs, and the current guy in charge of the EPA just simply thinks the science isn't there. Well, I've studied climate science for a very long time. I've taken in both master's and PhD courses, climate science. Not because I have to. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a cultural studies PhD. But I've actually studied it in terms of eco-criticism. So I've had to read the IPCC reports and I've had to read climate studies, like a lot of them, not all of them. I couldn't, because here's why. There's 10,000 plus articles that say that climate change is accelerated by humankind. 10,000 plus. You know how many say that it isn't? Less than 10. So how is it possible that less than 10 say it isn't, but 10,000 plus say it is? Well, oftentimes journalists feel it's their role to represent both sides, to make sure that we are an informed society, so that we should recognize that there is another point of view. But sometimes we don't understand that other point of view might be funded by lobbyists or special interest groups that are trying to look out for fossil fuels. But that's the type of information that we're lacking, because oftentimes we don't have enough time in our 24-hour news cycles, even though there's not 24 hours worth of news, but the excitement around it causes us to think that there's not enough time to understand a topic in depth. So oftentimes they move from one subject to another very rapidly, and they don't cover the idea that this type of science is science. Sure, science can never be 100%. There's no such thing as 100% science. It would leave out the idea that it can change. We believe even gravity itself is at 95%. That certainty is because our gravity on Earth, isn't the same as the gravity on some other Earth, or even in the space station. It depends on how it is, so we can't have that certainty. But it is 95% certain, and I would put that as pretty damn certain. So in that certainty, we should know that we should be doing something about it. As citizens, we should be concerned. Now, as you probably know, if you've seen Adam Ruins Anything, Everything, or even any show where they talk about how much your role can play in climate change, sure, each of us don't have that much, but if we start informing others and act as concerned citizens for this issue, we can start being better civic engaged people to help think about the future. Because maybe it won't affect us that much. Maybe our generation will live our entire lives without seeing too much change. Oh, we'll see it. I mean, during our lifetime, you're going to see longer winters, shorter summers, and sometimes longer summers and shorter winters. Sometimes you're going to see storms that last for days and you can't understand why. That's part of climate change. But it really isn't our life. It's our children and our grandchildren who will literally live during the change. Water will rise during their generation. The climate will be shifted during their generation. So shouldn't we be concerned? Shouldn't we be knowledgeable of what we can do to help understand that, maybe at this point we've gone too far and we can't change it, but maybe we should start considering how we can be better citizens to each other. And that's a lot of what this class is about. We're going to understand not only how to be civic engaged, but why information flows certain ways and where those information flows come from, to be more concerned and more intentional about our information consumption. Because if we're more intentional and more concerned, we'll be better people for it. Just like putting calories on a menu to make you have better information choices and consumption choices, by doing that about any subject, you become a better consumer. You can't turn off consumerism, but you can make people better consumers. And in doing so, we become better citizens and we can help each other out. So understanding how journalists roll and what they do is important to understanding how climate change is affected by this. A journalist is supposed to take information from a source that we're not really coherent in our understanding on, and they're supposed to translate it for the masses. Give us the power, illuminate us, give us that light. And in doing so, we become better people. This time is a very tenuous time for journalists and for information. But it doesn't mean to stop. It means to start understanding that we ourselves also have the power to tell those stories. But we should also seek out those who know how to tell those stories and what it is. So in the discussion, we'll have a few prompts based on this, but I want to make sure that you understand that we are being affected by climate change. But I also want to ask you to talk about what's the role of the journalist today? Do you think it is right for them to be giving both sides? I think that's important for us to think about, because is that what their responsibilities are? What is a journalist's responsibility? Should we know everything? Should we spend more time on it? Should we have more long reads and slow information? The slow news movement of actually having one subject that we understand fully? That's really up to you to start to understand and to break down, because you're the future of the world. So we all are. And so in doing that, we together can come up with these answers.